But what do I do to apply it, right? Like, what are the changes that you need to be going through to hopefully combat some of these things? And I want to be very clear on this. It's always interesting to see that no matter what subject I'm talking about, doesn't matter which gender I'm talking about, which age group I'm talking about, there are always parallels. That is addressed through proper strength training, heavy resistance training, and mobility training. Episode 48 of Pursuit of Balance. What's up, everybody? We're going to do a follow-up podcast on the Men Are Solar and Women Are Lunar episode. It's funny because like that episode, I would say, I don't know if uncomfortable is the word. Well, maybe to a degree. I would say that probably one of the more unknowledgeable subjects for me, a little bit uncomfortable because it's just a subject that obviously I don't talk about as much as a male, but even with my job. But it was a great episode for me as far as like the learning curve of it. And then ended up being the one with like the best feedback, which was interesting. So I was like, oh, cool. Like I got probably, I don't know, 10 or 12 emails like following up being like, thank you for talking about this. I love that you brought this up. But then out of the 10 or 12 that responded to it, I probably had about 75% of those being like, we should talk about menopause. We should talk about, and I was like, okay, I got to bring this up. And I was kind of sitting on it last week and I was like, do I wait and like have somebody, because one of our clients actually sent me a good rec for like a doctor and a sports scientist. So Millen, I know I owe you an email response, but so I'm going to do that, I think, as a combo, right? I would love to bring somebody on as a guest where we can talk about kind of exactly what I talked about in that one. With that one, for those who did not listen to that episode, men are solar, meaning like, hey, the testosterone cycle has a 24-hour cycle for a male. And then obviously the woman's cycle has a 28-day cycle, and your 4 different phases that you go through. And what are the changes in estrogen, progesterone, and obviously the changes that maybe should be happening towards nutrition and training. So I want to kind of do the exact same thing today. But I'm going to talk to my FL ladies that brought this up. For those that don't know, menopause obviously is something that happens later in life. The average age is 51. So we're going to kind of go through it. We're going to go through perimenopause, we're going to go through menopause, and then we're going to go through postmenopause. Talk a little bit about what happens. I wrote down some of the symptoms that happen, what happens with the estrogen and the progesterone, obviously with that drop in the new low baseline that's created from that. And then, as always, I'm going to talk a little bit about some training and nutrition changes. And then any maybe random rambling I can do on top of it that could be, on subject and on par for this topic. So I wrote these down. Obviously, I have a back and front page of a bunch of stuff because, once again, this is a fun subject that I got to learn about over the last, day or two. So stage 1, perimenopause. This is actually the interesting part is when we hear menopause. I've heard perimenopause, I heard menopause, and we would all think that like, okay, menopause is like the hard part of, this phase of life, right? For a female, but perimenopause is actually where more of the symptoms actually happen. And I'm sure that's just because some of the erratic changes that are happening from estrogen and progesterone overall. So this is stage 1. This will happen anywhere from like late 40s to early 40s for most females. This is something too, like as I was kind of going down the rabbit hole and researching, I was like, what are the things that can change the severity of the symptoms, the timing of when this happens for a female? And a lot of it felt like relatively generic, right? Like there's the things that like, for example, someone can start early in menopause in their life if they were actually underweight, right? So like the importance of not undereating or the eating disorder issues that can come along with that, and like how that has an effect on menopause and the timing of menopause, I guess, in your life. Versus someone that's actually more overweight, which was interesting, or obviously at a healthier weight that happens a little bit later in life. And that's just because of some of the relationship between holding adipose tissue fat and the estrogen relationship between both of them. So then there's always the typical thing, the stress, the sleep, and the symptomatic side of like, obviously someone that's just naturally a little bit more stressed out or underslept, like the symptoms are just going to seem more intense than they normally are. Someone that's smoking or drinking, interesting things like having a more Mediterranean style diet or prioritizing more fibrous foods were some things that actually kind of delayed and pushed menopause back a little bit later in life. Versus like the typical Western diet, which is, this as we call the SAD diet, the standard American diet, and how that actually moves it up a little bit in life cycle, right? So late 30s, early 40s, this stage, the perimenopause stage, lasts about 4 to 10 years, right? So it's a long, I mean, it's a cycle, right? So it's a full decade of something that's going on that's changing in your body. And this is where most of the symptoms obviously are going to begin. The estrogen swings are going to be very dramatic. And it was funny because I was like trying to look up like charts of like, I don't know if I shared that on my last email. I might have, where it was kind of going through the menstrual cycle or the 28-day cycle, right? And you have like the menstrual, the follicular, the ovulation, the luteal phase, and you kind of see these different like where estrogen peaks, progesterone at the very end of the cycle. I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple other hormones today too, which I'll touch on that later. But the big thing was just like the swings in estrogen that happen. And then progesterone is actually the first thing that's going to drop as well, right? So periods become more irregular, longer, heavier, lighter, but it's just because things are just more erratic overall, right? Stage 2 is menopause itself, right? So menopause is defined as 12 months without a period. And even on like some of the blood work and some of the things I was looking up was like FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone, and then there's going to be the thyroid stimulating hormone. There's going to be a couple things that I'm going to touch on a little bit later on these things. There's blood work that actually would be the labs that someone would take for a doctor to be like qualifying or stating that somebody's actually in menopause, but defined as basically saying, hey, I have 12 months without a period, right? So average age, like I touched on, is going to be 51 for this. Estrogen and progesterone are now at their new low, right? So if you were to look at a graph, I'll try to share this on the email newsletter for those that are following on that. But it's interesting. When you look at the perimenopause phase, you see this kind of like, it almost looks like it kind of goes through like a couple rebounds, right? Of estrogen. Progesterone just starts dropping earlier. And then what happens is both estrogen and progesterone, they kind of just flatline from then, right? So menopause to postmenopause, that's your new baseline. So that stays low the rest of your life, right? And that is obviously going to be the big thing that we're going to talk about today is like, what does the drop in estrogen or the drop in progesterone actually do to the body, right? What are the symptoms that come from that? And then maybe what are some of the changes that could be made to counteract, obviously, the change in hormones that happen for the rest of your life, right? So stage 3, which is the last one, is going to be postmenopause, right? Which is basically just post 12 months, right? So 12 months of no period is qualifying as menopause in the stage of menopause. Every day after that for the rest of your life, you're now in postmenopause, right? So this is where hormones stabilize, right? So they're new low baseline that you're going to maintain. The biggest health risk shift from reproductive health, right, in the beginning part of your life, now postmenopause is now to more cardiovascular, bone, metabolic changes, and the things that will happen from there. So those are your 3 stages that you're going to see. So this next section in the notes that I wrote down is basically like the biggest thing that actually happens here from what I've found is the change in basically the drastic drop in estrogen, right? So estrogen naturally peaks like at ovulation phase, right? And every 28 days, all the way up to whatever, 40 years old, late 30s, 50s, different for every female. So with the dramatic drop in estrogen, it affects a lot of different things, right? So first section, the brain, right? So serotonin, dopamine, your focus, your mood, there's a lot of changes that will happen there. Second thing is bones, right? It's the literal signal for the bone cells to maintain density, right? So this is going to be something we'll talk a little bit later with the training and nutrition side on how do we actually counteract some of the changes that can be happening to the bone density itself. Next one is muscles, right? So muscle protein synthesis, your insulin sensitivity, your recovery, things like that. Estrogen is a main driver of a lot of those. Skin and collagen, right? The skin and collagen, the interesting thing too is like actually in the perimenopause phase, there was some research showing that like there's up to like a dramatic drop of like 30% in collagen production in the perimenopause phase, right? So stage 1, there's actually a very dramatic change that happens, right? So once again, when we think about joint health, when we think about skin health, when we think about from the aesthetic side of wrinkles and things like that, like what are the things that we could be doing to pay attention to some of the changes that are happening in the decline of collagen? Urinary tissue, vaginal tissue, obviously changes happening from not having collagen down there. Cardiovascular health, right? So estrogen is cardioprotective, right? So with the drop, what is happening to the cardiovascular health? Insulin sensitivity, kind of touched on this a little bit with the muscle protein synthesis. And then the last one is going to be the sleep architecture, right? So the sleep will change too. So this is where we're going to talk a little bit with some of the hot flashes or some of the night sweats or some of the irregular sleep patterns that get created. And mainly a lot of those symptoms are going to show up more perimenopause in stage 1, like I said, but those are kind of the things that we see on the estrogen side. Now, progesterone also drops, it drops first. And I'm going to touch on this a little bit more when I get in the symptoms of detail with the sleep quality. But sleep quality, anxiety regulation, there was actually some cool stuff that I found that was like the metabolites of progesterone are anti-anxiety in a sense, right? So meaning that like with this drop, your anxiety regulation is not as good, which when we think about from the mood side of things, like what are the things that should be changing or could be changing to maybe help counterbalance that as well. And then obviously like in relationship to mood stability. So those are the two big things, right? So when we think about like, I do have clients that personal clients of mine and clients that just brought this up from that previous episode that I was talking about a couple weeks ago. And, kind of my old knowledge on, it's even funny. My mom's very similar to myself and my dad, and just like, you just keep working, you just keep grinding through these things. And, I had a couple follow-up emails too from some people that even gave some challenging remarks in a good way, in a healthy way. And I love those challenging remarks. So don't be afraid to send me emails because it allows me to dive even a little bit deeper. That some of the stuff that I talked about, even on the Woman Are Lunar, and like changing your diet, or changing your training, or changing things, adapting around the cycle, there's not that much science backing it up, right? But it is more important from some of the stuff that I got feedback on to just basically listening to your body, which in a sense is, an indirect way of kind of what I'm talking about anyways, is like, hey, through these, not perimenopause, menopause, postmenopause, I'm talking pre, right? So 0, whatever. Start having your periods up to late 30s, 40s, like we're talking about, that age gap, right? That timeline in your life. There are changes that happen every month, right? Every 28 days. So there's differences on your cravings. There's difference on your ability to recover. There's difference on your ability to relax, and like the prioritizing more relaxation, like I talked about in that episode. So the big symptoms from what I found, and I wrote these down in no particular order, right, is number one is, we hear this a lot, but hot flashes and night sweats, right? The brain's temperature regulation center loses estrogen stabilizing influence, right? So estrogen, from what I found, is the influence on stabilizing and regulating temperature for the body, right? So when we have a dramatic drop in estrogen, obviously through these phases and through this part of life, basically the thermostat just becomes erratic, right? This is kind of an easy way to think about that, right? So that's one. So that's what we see with kind of the hot flash night sweat. Number two is brain fog and memory. Where does this happen from? Estrogen supports neurotransmitter production and brain glucose metabolism. Meaning when it drops cognition, it can feel sluggish, especially perimenopause, and stabilizes in more postmenopause. A lot of the symptoms, just because they're so erratic for the 4 to 10 years of stage 1 of perimenopause, those symptoms feel more severe and they feel more intense because you're going from having a regular period for a big chunk of your life, and then suddenly things are changing, right? So the symptoms will be worse from what I saw in the stage 1. And then during menopause and postmenopause, it kind of stabilizes out, right? So that's where some of that brain fog memory part. Sleep disruption. So this is what I was just talking on, is like progesterone is a natural sedative, right? Estrogen helps regulate body temperature at night. So you get two things. When progesterone is high or going through its regular cycles of life, you're getting this kind of sedative kind of feeling from progesterone, right? When you lose that, right? And that was what I was talking about with the kind of the metabolite of progesterone, meaning when progesterone drops, you lose some of that ability, right? So this is where some of and anybody, like, and just to kind of make this, I know this is going to be probably an episode that's more attractive to females to listen to, but for anybody, doesn't matter if you're a male or female, like, think about it. When you're more anxious or more stressed and having a hard time regulating that, you don't sleep well, right? I know I don't, right? And then also the same thing with core body temperature. Why do we say when we talk about sleep training or sleep hacking that we want to make the room cold? So if you don't have good regulation of your body temperature, that also is going to disrupt the sleep and the architecture of the sleep itself, right? Next one I wrote down is mood changes, anxiety, irritability. So this one's kind of related more to serotonin. So serotonin drops with estrogen, meaning when estrogen drops, so does serotonin. Progesterone has a metabolite, which is a natural anti-anxiety chemical, which is kind of in relationship to a couple things that I've already talked about. Next one, weight gain. I want to have this with a little bit of context. You lose a little bit of insulin sensitivity when estrogen drops, right? So prior to perimenopause, menopause, postmenopause, when estrogen's high, right, your body can handle carbohydrates a little bit more effectively, right? And this is why I talked about in that episode that this would actually be a good time to train a little bit harder. This would be a good time to, if you did want to be more restrictive with a little bit of calories or carbs, if you wanted to, like that would be a good phase if you were someone that is like feeling the changes that happen during those parts of the cycle, right? Because your body has a better ability of extracting the nutrients that it needs and transporting them into the muscle. That's just like the Spark Notes way to say it. So with the the estrogen drop, you lose a little bit of insulin sensitivity, which could impact your ability to maybe handle carbs or calories as well, right? Decreased libido. Next one I wrote down, hair thinning and skin changes, and that's obviously in relationship to what I was just talking about. Collagen can drop up to 30% up in the first 5 years of perimenopause. And then the last one I wrote down is bone density loss, right? And this is kind of the FSH, right? So FSH, like I said earlier, is a follicle stimulating hormone, right? Then there's LH, which is luteinizing hormone. Both of those actually go high through menopause and they stay relatively high the rest of your life, right? They have a cycle, a 28-day cycle when you are having your periods, right? When you get into perimenopause, they start to increase because we're starting to see estrogen and progesterone drop. This is a graph that I hopefully maybe will share over this video, and hopefully Elliot will clip it over. I'll send it to him, or I'll also put it on the email so you can kind of see it, because for me, I had to be very visual when I was even just going through this learning process of this data. But also the FSH, it was interesting with some of the bone density, was some of the things that impacted the density of the bone was related to that hormone as well too. So now let's kind of segue into what are the changes that need to be made, right? Because when we think about, okay, all this stuff, it's information, it's education, it's great. But what do I do to apply it, right? Like, what are the changes that you need to be going through to hopefully combat some of these things? And I want to be very clear on this. It's always interesting to see that no matter what subject I'm talking about, doesn't matter which gender I'm talking about, which age group I'm talking about, there are always parallels, right? First and foremost, let's talk about bone density, right? Let's talk about the muscle loss. Let's talk about joint health and the cartilage and the mobility. Let's talk about posture. Let's talk about those things. That is addressed through proper strength training, heavy resistance training, and mobility training. And what was interesting from some of the stuff that I was looking up, it was actually saying even more so than ever, you should be prioritizing that. And I will say there's a good book called Outlive by Peter Attia. I know Peter Attia's got a lot of heat lately, so no one likes to talk about him anymore for, other reasons that I don't need to touch on or don't even know about is a better way to say it. But his book is phenomenal. His education's phenomenal. He might be a little bit weird, a little bit off. And that book brought out, I always used to kind of say this as a joke over the last year and a half, 2 years when it came out. I was like, man, I should start paying this guy commission, because I had a lot of people coming in that were like, hey, I'm seeing all this studies and all this data coming out saying that like we lose muscle as we get older, right? And bone density doesn't, or we like lose bone density. And the best way to combat that is strength training, right? And heavy resistance training, right? And it was funny, like in the research, it was like prioritize heavy resistance training, right? Don't go in and do moderate loads and moderate weights. There's context to that, and I'll touch on that in a second. But you need to understand that in order to build muscle, like how do we, like to give you guys the mechanism of like improving bone density, when you're under load, a barbell, a kettlebell, a dumbbell, a cable, resistance training with body weight training only, right? Your body is receiving a stimulus that, holy shit, this is heavy, right? And with the mechanical tension that's required, you're going to be building muscle with that, right? Because your body's adaptation to that stimulus is basically like, well, let's just keep building muscle so we can become stronger, so we can adapt to this load that's being provided here. And that adaptation exists with running, aerobic. It adapts to mobility and your range of motion. Like it's all the same thing, stimulus, adaptation, and that cycle between those two. Now, the mechanical tension when the muscle pulls on a tendon, and the tendon is obviously, because so thinking about it this way, muscle's connected to a tendon, right? A tendon is the thing that connects the muscle to the bone. Ligaments connect bone to bone. So how do we improve tendon health? How do we improve bone density? How do we improve ligament health? Those type of things like ligaments and tendons are not like muscle, right? It's a different type of tissue. But we can strengthen these things, right? Like when we think about in the rehab world, we use a lot of like overcoming and like overcoming isometrics. Isometrics in general are great rehab tools, but it's great for tendon health, right? Because sometimes we need a long enough volume or duration at a certain position or a certain load for me to actually get that adaptation, right? So when it comes to resistance training, that mechanical tension and pulling on the bones via muscle to tendons and bone is what is going to improve bone density. Another thing that I found, which is very interesting for this cycle, because I know some people, and this was last week's episode or 2 weeks ago, is plyometrics, box jumps, jumping, jump rope, sprinting, like doing things that have impact. What is that impact going to do that walking's not going to do? What is like doing a box jump going to do that doing steps is not going to do? And the impact, you're receiving a lot more force than normal. That force is going to create adaptation. What is the adaptation? Become stiffer, right? When you look at like very high level athletes, right? It doesn't matter if they're a basketball player with the vertical that they have, or if it's Usain Bolt with his 100-meter dash, right? Like they are very stiff in certain areas. And the reason why stiffness is a good thing for them, because that adaptation is stiffness transfers energy more effectively, right? So we want to be stiff in certain areas, right? We don't want to just be mobile and lax, right? We want to be stiff in certain areas of the body. It's like the Achilles tendon when you think about jumping and plyometrics and things like that. But that energy transfer also is going to lead to what? Bone density improvement, right? So that was a huge thing. Sprinting obviously is one of those things that I think a lot of people, there is an interesting fact, and I'm not going to say the percentage because I know I'm going to totally butcher it, and I don't know it off the top of my head. But like it's a majority. It's well above 50%, and I want to say, if I remember, I want to say it's like 70 or 80+% of people will never sprint again after they get out of sports. Sprinting is one of the most effective things that we have for improving VO2 max, improving speed. And then kind of on the subject of what we're talking about right now is the bounding effect of sprinting, because there is a lot more force that's applied through the ground when I am sprinting versus walking or jogging or doing a light run. Right. So some of those effects on training. And then the other aspect, which I kind of touched on already is a little bit, is like improving mobility, right? Because with some of the collagen degradation that happens, the bone density part of it, the muscle loss, things like that, we want to make sure that we're prioritizing the way that we move, right? So our posture, our mobility, and remember, is not just range of motion for the sake of flexibility, it's range of motion with strength. And that is what the definition of mobility is. Mobility is the strength within a range of motion. Flexibility is the passive ability for a tissue to lengthen or stretch or go through a range. So having mobility is a combination of, yes, I want to prioritize range, but I also want to prioritize owning that range, right? Because that is the strength aspect of what we're seeing. So the easiest little ROI, or the tip I can give you guys with ROI of your training, 2 or 3 days a week minimum, ideally, of resistance training. And your resistance training should have elements of progressive overload. I have plenty of clients that come through this gym, right? And I can name so many off the top of my head, right? And I'm not going to name drop, but that are just, it's always so cool to see with like my older demographic of the people that are like in their 50s or 60s or 70s, and they're setting PRs and they're deadlifting more than the 20-year-olds. And I'm like, I love it. Like I love seeing it, because it just goes to show you that to a degree, age is just a number. Right? Like it is just a thing that you can either use and play victim to and just be like, I can't do this, I'm older, or I'm going through this phase of life. Or you can let it empower you, right? And you can learn to adapt and overcome some of those things. And all the changes that are happening to your body hormonally, metabolically, are changes that could be accommodated too, right? Like we could go through different levels of lifestyle to help reverse some of these things, or at least not let them impact us in a negative way with our lifestyle, right? So that's a huge one. Resistance training, mobility training. Now, nutrition. What am I going to say? Could you guys guess? Eating more protein, right? And it was interesting from some of the stuff that I was looking at, and I just interesting and not interesting, but it was like even the RDA is clearly very low for the amount of protein that's required. I always hate that they do it in like kilograms to your pounds of body weight, because I'm like, I'm American. I don't think like that. I need things in pounds. Or grams, I'm sorry. So it's like, for me, it's like 1 gram per pound, or 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight, or ideal body weight. For a female, most of my female clients, I always say minimum 0.7, right? So easy math. If you're a 100-pound female, I would say 70 grams of protein, right? Up to 85. Or if you're a savage and you can get to 1 gram per pound, cool, get up to 100. So it's obviously dictated by your body weight, but prioritizing protein. Why? Because we're losing muscle, because we're losing collagen. And can we get that stuff through the diet? Yeah, a whole food diet, nose to tail, having more of those things where I balance out the amino acid profile of the nutrition that I'm taking in helps obviously with that. So big thing was protein, obviously. Second thing was eating more fiber, obviously. When it comes to carbs, a lot of the things was just like, don't be scared of carbs. Reducing carbs to a very low level is not something that I think almost any human should be doing for at least let me say this differently. I have no problem with someone going through a low carb season or a low carb reset diet or elimination diet, because I think there's benefits to maybe having moderate to low fat and low carb, and then obviously having moderate to high protein for a period of time. I think it's a great elimination diet for a lot of people. But when you think about what your body runs on, it needs glucose, right? And being scared of carbs is not the answer. And I was just talking to a client of mine, and he was basically, his doctor was saying one thing, the nutritionist through the doctor referral that he got was saying kind of the other thing. And he was like, she was saying to him that you need to just basically cut your carbs. And then as I was having a conversation with him, I realized, I'm like, she's not saying cut your carbs. She's saying cut the simple processed carbs, which it doesn't matter who you're talking to and what your labs look like or what your weight is. I would say that to everybody, right? Like if you're a young athlete, super active, sure, you can get away with eating donuts. You can get away with having sodas. You can get away with things more so than somebody that doesn't have that. But it will have a point of diminishing returns, clearly, right? So the more active you are, the more allowance you have on some of those things. So the takeaway is carbs are great, but prioritize more complex fibrous carbs. What is that? Vegetables, potatoes. Don't be scared of potatoes. How you prep them, maybe a little bit. Fruits. Don't be scared of fruits. Try to do your best to eat them in season. Having things like rice. I'm not scared of rice. There's plenty of cultures that have plenty of rice and that have way better health labs than Americans do, right? So having things that are just going to be more natural sources of carbs is what we want. And then we want to moderate fat. Fat is something that I think during the keto wave got a little taken out of context, and people were just eating butter and bacon and just too much fat for just the sake of it's keto, I'm burning more fat. And the answer is like, well, no shit, you're burning more fat because like you're eating more fat. What do you think your body is going to use as a substrate? So moderate the fat, moderate the carbs. If you have the ability, put your carbs around your activity. Have the carbs a little bit more in the morning, or at least when the sun's out. Be careful with high carb meals late at night. I struggle with this more so than anybody that's probably listening to this. But those are the big things of the diet, right? It's just like, it's coming back to some of the basics, right? Like I would love to sit here and tell you that like there is something special about perimenopause and menopause and postmenopause that can change the way you train and change the way your nutrition should look. And the answer is like, it's really not. It's really about being consistent through it all. And the more consistent, even a better way to look at this, like me and my wife talk about this a lot with just like with her pregnancy right now. It was just like, every client that I've trained through a pregnancy had a phenomenal pregnancy when they came in through it fit, right? And we've all heard horror stories, either through friends or coworkers or just people, of pregnancy not being the easiest thing. And no matter what, I want to make sure this is clear. I'm not saying pregnancy is easy if you do so. I'm just saying it's easier if you do so. But coming into this stage of life, right? So just because we start to lose muscle and we lose bone density in our 30s and towards for the rest of our life doesn't mean that we should start taking strength training serious then. The earlier you can get on this horse, the earlier you can get into this lifestyle, the easier that phase and the changes that will happen in your life will be for you, right? So always prioritize strength training. It's not specific to perimenopause or menopause at the timing of your cycle, right? The only thing that I would say maybe be aware of with your intensity specific to this episode on the menopause side is like, if you are having really, really big changes in your sleep, you're having really, really big changes in your energy levels, then yeah, maybe you're not going for a PR today. Maybe you're not setting a world record today. But be mindful that you do need to prioritize the habit of always being there, even if you are low energy, because it's a much better habit to show up to the gym and give me 50% effort than it is to skip the gym and do nothing, right? And zero, obviously. So understand that these habits build the lifestyle. The lifestyle makes the adaptation towards these changes that do happen in the earlier parts, the later parts of your life, whatever it might be, much easier. And I can tell you with my own evidence from the clients that I've seen and trained myself that there is no limitation to the age and resistance training, right? There is always been stigma around heavy lifting. And, a lot of like my female demographic, I get that question a lot with assessments. And it's a fair question that like, am I going to be able to do this? Right. Like, cause this, like it's always been like bro culture for such a long period of time. Right. It's like, my mom's generation is like, she would teach step aerobics and, weight training was like a thing, but it wasn't like as mainstream. I feel like now it's like some of the health stuff is becoming more mainstream. Everything's got protein in it, right? Everything's talking about fiber, right? Everyone's talking about resistance training and the effects that it has. So like, those are things that I'm glad are becoming more mainstream, but to be transparent with you, I've been doing it for 18 years and it's never changed. It's always been weight train. It's always been prioritize more protein. It's always been prioritize more whole foods. So, I would love to say, like I mentioned earlier, to give you some secret sauce, but the reality is like, there is no secret. The secret is just you being consistent with it the rest of your life and understanding that changes are being made, but let's focus on what you can control. And if you can't control that, then why focus on it, right? Let's just go through the things that we can't control, which are the lifestyle changes that could be made for that. And yeah, so that's my take on menopause. What am I going to title it? Menopause isn't a decline. It's a different operating system. Episode 48. Hope you guys enjoyed. Share it with somebody.